Hello and welcome to Starlit Science Stories, where curiosity drifts as gently as snow and science is served just warm enough to tuck you in. Tonight, we're traveling far back in time, hundreds of millions of years, when our planet was locked in an icy embrace. Yes, we're talking about Snowball Earth, a time when glaciers reached the equator, life clung on beneath frozen oceans, and Earth itself might have looked like a cosmic scoop of vanilla ice cream. Now, I do hope this video doesn't keep you up with too many exciting facts, but if it does, well, at least you'll be tossing and turning with a head full of ancient geology and climate feedback loops, which is a pretty good trade, if you ask me. Before we dive in, I'd be so grateful if you gave this video a gentle like and a cozy little subscribe. It really helps the channel drift along. And just for fun, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Are you winding down at 10 p.m. in Tokyo or barely keeping your eyes open at 2 a.m. in Toronto? Now then, get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin our story, one that starts not with fire and fury, but with frost. Close your eyes, if they aren't already, and picture the Earth, but not the blue marble you know today, bursting with life and swirling clouds. Instead, imagine a quieter, lonelier world. The continents are unrecognizable, clumped together in strange shapes. The skies are often hazy. The sun is fainter, and the air, well, let's just say it wouldn't do your lungs any favors. This is Earth more than 700 million years ago, during a chapter of deep time known as the Proterozoic Eon. It's a time so distant that the dinosaurs were still just a cosmic daydream, and mammals, we were less than a glimmer in the genetic soup. At first glance, this ancient Earth might seem dull. No forests, no flowers, no buzzing bees or roaring predators, just lots of rock, water, and microbes. But below the surface, the planet was quietly preparing for one of the most extreme events in its long, dramatic life. Now, here's something curious. Despite being closer to the equator, parts of the land were covered in ice, and not just a light dusting like your front yard in February. We're talking vast sheets of glacial ice creeping steadily toward the tropics. It's a bit like finding penguins sipping coconut water on a beach in the Bahamas. Something was very, very off. But before the freeze, there was heat. The Proterozoic had its fair share of warmth, volcanic activity, and shifting supercontinents. At the time, much of Earth's landmass was united into a single massive supercontinent called Rodinia, not quite as famous as Pangaea, but just as dramatic in its own right. Rodinia stretched and cracked across the globe, altering ocean currents, changing weather patterns, and setting tectonic plates into motion like slow-grinding puzzle pieces. These tectonic shifts were more than just geological fidgeting. When Rodinia began to rift apart, it changed the balance of land and sea in a way that had massive consequences for the climate. More coastlines meant more rainfall, which meant more erosion, which meant more carbon dioxide was pulled out of the atmosphere. And here's the kicker, CO2 is one of Earth's main greenhouse gases. So, less of it meant less heat being trapped. The planet began to cool, slowly, relentlessly. But let's not blame poor Rodinia alone. The sun was also younger and dimmer back then. In fact, scientists estimate it shone about 6% less brightly than it does today. That might not sound like much, but on a planetary scale, it's the difference between a cozy afternoon and a deep freeze. Combine that with fewer animals, fewer trees, and lower biological activity overall, and you get a planet that's not very good at trapping heat. Earth was already skating on thin thermal ice, and it didn't take much to tip it into an actual glaciation. Now, Earth's climate doesn't just politely dip into winter and back again. It can go into what scientists call positive feedback loops, where one effect triggers another, and that second effect intensifies the first, a sort of climate echo chamber. Here's an example. Snow and ice are very reflective. They bounce sunlight back into space, which cools the planet more, which creates more ice, which reflects more sunlight. And so you get the idea. It's like Earth caught a cold and then kept sneezing itself into the freezer. As more ice spread from the poles toward the equator, global temperatures plummeted. And here's where things take a turn for the truly bizarre. The idea that this glaciation wasn't just a typical ice age, but that it covered the entire planet, oceans, continents, everything. This is the heart of the Snowball Earth hypothesis, a vision of our world frozen from pole to pole, locked in a deep planetary slumber that lasted millions of years. But wait, how do we know any of this happened? We weren't exactly keeping weather logs back then. That's where geology steps in, like the hero of a slow-burn mystery novel. In ancient rocks found all over the world, from Australia to Namibia to Canada, scientists have uncovered something strange: glacial deposits near the equator. These are rocks that were carried and dropped by ancient glaciers, called dropstones, and they're embedded in layers of what were once warm, shallow ocean sediments. That's like finding frostbite in a tropical sunburn. Add to that the discovery of glacial striations, scratches on bedrock left by moving ice, and odd chemical signatures in marine sediments, and the case grows stronger. Earth was cold, really cold, and not just in scattered patches, but globally. Of course, not everyone agrees on the full extent of the freeze. Some scientists suggest a slushball Earth scenario where the equator remained partly open water, surrounded by ice. Still cold, still harsh, but not quite a full deep freeze. Think of it as the difference between a frozen smoothie and an ice cube. But even if it wasn't a perfect snowball, the evidence points to a time when ice stretched further and lasted longer than any other known period in Earth's history. A time when life had to adapt or perish. A time when Earth quite literally hit the pause button. And that's where we'll leave things tonight, in the calm before the ice. A quiet world, ancient and unfamiliar, just beginning to slide into the coldest chapter it's ever known. So, snuggle in and get ready for Chapter 2, where the frost tightens its grip and the world begins to freeze from the outside in. Imagine standing on a rocky shoreline. The waves are quiet, the wind cold, and the horizon disturbingly white. The chill bites at your skin, even in what should be the tropics. A glacier, massive, slow, and gleaming, creeps steadily toward the equator. It's the kind of scene that would make even a penguin think, "Bit much, isn't it?" This is the beginning of Earth's most severe ice age. Not just a brisk winter's day, but a planetary deep freeze. The Snowball Earth event was not something that happened overnight. It was a slow-motion disaster, unfolding over thousands, even millions of years. But once it started, well, things got frosty fast. So, how exactly does a planet accidentally lock itself in a freezer? The leading suspect is a cascade of feedback loops. Earth, you see, is a drama queen when it comes to climate, capable of wild swings when the right dominoes fall. And one of the first to tip over in our story was carbon dioxide. As we touched on in the last chapter, the breakup of Rodinia created new coastlines and exposed fresh rock to the elements. Rain, wind, and weather wore these rocks down, triggering a process called chemical weathering. When silicate rocks break down, they actually pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It's a slow process, but over long stretches of time, it's incredibly effective. The result, a long-term drawdown of atmospheric CO2. Think of it like Earth trying to chill out by breathing a little too deeply for a little too long. And once that CO2 level dropped low enough, global temperatures followed. Less CO2 means less heat trapped near the surface, and less heat means more ice. And here's the kicker. Ice reflects sunlight. Unlike darker surfaces like forests or oceans, snow and ice send solar energy bouncing right back into space. That's called albedo, and it's a major player in Earth's thermostat. So now you've got a planet with less CO2 cooling down, forming ice, and that ice is reflecting more sunlight, which cools the planet further, forming more ice, reflecting even more sunlight. It's the climate version of someone pulling the blanket off your bed in winter, only to follow it up by opening all the windows for good measure. This is what scientists call a runaway ice albedo feedback loop. Once the ice started to spread, it encouraged more ice to form, and Earth couldn't stop itself. The process accelerated. Ice advanced from the poles, then from the mid-latitudes, and eventually, perhaps even all the way to the equator. If you're picturing Earth as a slowly spinning snow globe right now, you're not far off. But the cooling wasn't just a matter of temperature. Oceans began to change, too. Sea ice thickened, salinity shifted, currents slowed or altered, and beneath the surface, marine life, what little of it existed, faced a crisis. Many photosynthetic microbes relied on sunlight, and with thick layers of ice above, light penetration dropped drastically. If there were no refuges, life could have been extinguished entirely. Fortunately, nature is full of weird little loopholes. Some sunlight may have filtered through cracks in thinner areas of equatorial ice. And in the ocean's depths, near hydrothermal vents, chemosynthetic life flourished, using heat and minerals rather than sunlight. These microbial oases became critical lifeboats in a world otherwise plunged into stillness and cold. And if you're thinking, how do we know any of this? Well, Earth is surprisingly good at leaving behind clues. Like a detective at the scene of a very, very old crime, geologists have uncovered compelling evidence of the Big Chill. Take dropstones, for instance. These are rocks that were carried by glaciers and then dropped into fine ocean sediments when the icebergs melted. They're like little geological confetti scattered across ancient marine beds in places they absolutely shouldn't be, like near the equator. Then there are glacial striations, scratches on bedrock carved by the slow grind of ancient glaciers. These appear on rocks that now sit in tropical latitudes. It's like finding sled marks in the Sahara. Even more telling is the global timing in rock layers all over the world. You see the same pattern. Signs of glaciation followed abruptly by cap carbonates, special layers of limestone that indicate a sudden, extreme warming event. But we'll get to that in a future chapter. For now, we're focused on the freeze. So, with ice pressing in from all sides and Earth's thermostat stuck in the Arctic blast setting, what did the world actually look like? Well, if you could orbit the planet in a spaceship, assuming you weren't frozen solid, you'd see a shining white sphere. Land, ocean, clouds, all covered by a thick blanket of ice and snow. The atmosphere was thin, dry, and eerily quiet. Winds howled, but there were no birds to ride them. The only movement came from creeping glaciers and bubbling hydrothermal vents hidden deep beneath the ocean ice. And yet, even in this frigid silence, life endured. Microbes clung to rocks, nestled in cracks, or floated just beneath the ice, feeding on whatever scraps of chemical energy they could find. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to survive, enough to keep the flame of life alive through Earth's longest, coldest night. Because this wasn't the end of the story. No, the freeze was only half of the tale. Earth may have become a snowball, but it didn't stay that way forever. Somewhere deep within the planet, pressure was building. Volcanoes continued to erupt, slowly pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, even as the surface froze. And over millions of years, that CO2 began to accumulate until one day, geologically speaking, it became too much. But we'll save that warm revelation for Chapter 3. For now, Pull the blanket a little tighter and imagine a world turned to ice, still quiet, waiting for the sun to return. So here we are. Earth is frozen, a world of glaciers that stretch across continents, oceans sealed beneath kilometers of ice, and temperatures that would make even an Antarctic winter seem balmy. No trees, no fish, no ferns, just silence. But here's the miracle. Even in a world turned to glass, life refused to quit. Let's set the stage. This is over 600 million years ago, and Earth is in the grip of a full-blown snowball event. For all we know, the surface is entirely encased in ice, maybe even as much as a kilometer thick in some places. If you were somehow standing there, the horizon would be a white infinity, the seas frozen, the land buried, the skies thin and colorless. But zoom in closer, deeper beneath the icy crust of the oceans, where sunlight barely tickles through, or maybe doesn't reach at all. Life keeps going, quietly, tenaciously. Most of it is microbial, no animals yet, no plants waving in the current, just tiny, ancient organisms, cyanobacteria, archaea, and extremophiles surviving in the harshest conditions imaginable. If Earth's surface was in hibernation, these little survivors were like glowing embers hidden in the ash, waiting for the world to warm up. One possible safe haven, hydrothermal vents. These are cracks in the seafloor where the Earth's inner heat leaks into the ocean, releasing warm, mineral-rich fluids. Even during the snowball events, these vents kept bubbling. Around them, colonies of microbes thrived, not needing sunlight at all. They used chemosynthesis, converting chemicals like hydrogen sulfide into energy. It's a clever little trick, and one we still see in some of Earth's most remote places today, like deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, where tube worms and clams form strange ecosystems around black smokers. Back in the snowball era, these vent systems may have been the strongholds of life. But vents weren't the only option. Some scientists believe there were refugia, areas where the ice was thinner or broken. Perhaps near the equator, the ice was only a few meters thick, thin enough to let a little light through, just enough for photosynthetic life to eke out a living. Imagine microbial mats clinging to the undersides of the ice, like algae growing on the roof of a frozen cave. These under-ice habitats might have resembled modern sea ice ecosystems we see in the Arctic and Antarctic today. In those frigid zones, entire communities of life live within the slushy, icy underlayers, tiny crustaceans, bacteria, and algae dancing in slow motion, suspended in briny channels. Even in deep freeze, Earth didn't switch off entirely. Of course, it wasn't easy living. These were likely low-energy ecosystems, no big booms of productivity. Everything moved slowly. Microbes reproduced less often. Nutrients were scarce. But life isn't picky. Life adapts. And let's take a moment to appreciate that, because life's ability to hang on under such brutal conditions tells us something profound, not just about Earth's history, but about life itself. It's tenacious. It doesn't need comfort. It just needs a niche, a crack, a vent, a thin ray of light, or a chemical to chew on. And that brings us to the real heroes of this era, stromatolites. These are layered structures built by colonies of cyanobacteria, some of the oldest known life forms on Earth. Before the snowball event, stromatolites were everywhere, decorating shallow seas with their lumpy, reef-like forms. During the freeze, many disappeared, but some may have endured, especially in warmer geothermal regions. Today, we find ancient stromatolite fossils and rocks dating back billions of years, silent testimony to microbial perseverance. And in a few rare places, like Shark Bay in Australia, stromatolites still grow today, little living relics of Earth's earliest life. Now here's a fun thought to tuck under your pillow. If microbes survive Snowball Earth, could they survive on other frozen planets? Astrobiologists certainly think so. If we ever find life on icy moons like Europa or Enceladus, moons with subsurface oceans beneath thick ice shells, it might look a lot like what survived our own snowball periods, microbial, tucked away in vent systems or clinging to icy undersides, humming along quietly in total darkness. In fact, studying Earth's snowball periods has become a kind of dress rehearsal for extraterrestrial life. It shows us that life doesn't need warmth and sunshine. It just needs a tiny foothold in time. But not everyone made it through. The snowball event was likely a massive bottleneck for biodiversity. Many microbial lineages were wiped out, and those that survived had to evolve new tricks: tougher membranes, better enzymes, tolerance for salt, cold, and pressure. In a strange way, the hardship may have helped set the stage for what came next: more complex, multicellular life. Some theories even suggest that the stress of a snowball may have nudged evolution forward. When the world thawed, suddenly, dramatically, nutrients flooded back into the oceans, CO2 levels spiked, and ecosystems rebooted. And in that flush of opportunity, life began to diversify like never before. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, just picture it. A world locked in stillness, the surface frozen solid, the skies pale and empty, and deep below, in darkness, life quietly ticking onward, microbes in their frosty strongholds, humming out their chemical lullabies, generation after generation. They didn't know it, but they were holding the line, keeping Earth's biological flame from going out entirely. And in a few million years, the thaw would come. So, take a deep breath and let that idea settle. Life, in its smallest forms, has endured fire, ice, poison, and pressure. And it did so long before we ever walked the earth. It's a comforting thought that resilience is built into our very DNA. Next time, in Chapter 4, we'll crack open the rocks and see what they can tell us. Because while microbes were surviving in the shadows, Earth was quietly recording their struggle in stone. Earth doesn't write in ink. It writes in layers, in rock, in dust, in the quiet accumulation of time, pressed down and hardened into memory. When we want to know what happened hundreds of millions of years ago, long before fossils of animals, long before forests or bones, we don't look for diaries or cave paintings. We look for the scars and whispers left in stone. And when it comes to Snowball Earth, the planet left us some fascinating geological breadcrumbs. Let's start with one of the strangest sights a geologist can encounter: glacial deposits in the tropics. These aren't just your average pebbles. They're drop stones, rocks that were carried by glaciers, then released into soft, muddy ocean sediments when the icebergs that held them finally melted. They fall with a quiet plop, settle into the seabed, and over time become frozen in place by layers of compacting sediment. Now, here's where things get truly puzzling. We find these drop stones in places like Namibia, Australia, Brazil, and Canada, regions that were near the equator at the time these rocks were laid down. That's like discovering a snowball fight broke out at the equator during the summer. These stones aren't alone. We also find striated pavements, bedrock scratched and grooved by the grinding motion of glaciers. You can run your fingers along these grooves today, and you're literally feeling the ancient touch of a long-lost ice sheet. It's oddly poetic, like shaking hands across time with the ghost of a glacier. And then there are the cap carbonates. These are thin, distinctive layers of limestone and dolomite that sit right on top of glacial deposits. Geologically speaking, they're like a frosting spread neatly over the rocky remnants of a frozen Earth. What makes them fascinating is that they formed rapidly in shallow seas and contain chemical signals that suggest extremely high levels of atmospheric CO2. How do you go from ice-covered oceans to tropical carbonate seas in a geological blink of an eye? That question is exactly why cap carbonates are such a crucial clue. They tell us that the end of Snowball Earth was just as dramatic as the beginning. When Earth finally escaped the deep freeze, the thaw was swift and intense. And the cap carbonates, they're the evidence, showing that warm, carbonate-rich seas flooded the newly exposed land masses, depositing those telltale minerals in a frenzy of rebounding life and chemistry. But let's not get too far ahead. For now, just marvel at the detective work involved here. Geologists have spent decades piecing together the story, analyzing isotope ratios, measuring ancient magnetic signatures to determine latitude, and using radiometric dating to build a timeline. They don't just find a rock and say, yes, clearly this came from 720 million years ago. It's more like slowly assembling a 10,000-piece puzzle without the box. Some of the most compelling Snowball Earth evidence comes from places like Namibia, where beautifully preserved cap carbonates rest atop glacial tillites, glacial debris cemented into stone. The Mackenzie Mountains of Canada, where layers show the progression from glacial deposits to sudden tropical seas, and South Australia, where banded iron formations and carbonate layers offer a window into ancient ocean chemistry. Together, these global clues suggest a synchronous glaciation, a planetary-scale freeze that affected every continent at roughly the same time. But rocks don't just record what happened, they hint at how. For example, some sediments contain banded iron formations, which usually appear when iron-rich waters meet oxygen. These layers hint that the oceans, once stratified and low in oxygen, were suddenly stirred and oxygenated, possibly by the thaw and the rush of new life. Then there are sulfur isotopes and carbon isotope excursions, which suggest massive disruptions in the carbon cycle, like what you'd expect if CO2 levels skyrocketed after millions of years of volcanic buildup under ice. In other words, Earth wasn't just frozen, it was holding its breath. And when the thaw came, it exhaled with force. Let's take a moment here. Rocks may seem like lifeless things, but in a way, they're storytellers, patient, stoic, full of details for those who know how to listen. They've endured storms, earthquakes, the crawl of continents, and they remember. It's remarkable, really, that we can reconstruct such a distant chapter from clues embedded in cliffs and outcrops. The rocks tell us not just that there was a Snowball Earth, but how far the ice spread, how the oceans responded, and how life survived the chill. And in those rocks, we also find the seeds of what came next: warmth, recovery, and possibly even the beginning of the grand experiment we call complex life. But we're not quite there yet. First, we need to understand how Earth escaped the freeze, because it didn't just melt like your average snowman in spring. It took millions of years of silent volcanic labor, spewing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, one burp at a time, before the planet got warm enough to break the cycle. In Chapter 5, we'll ride that rising tide of CO2 into one of the most dramatic climate reversals in planetary history. Until then, picture the quiet clarity of ancient stone, the way it hums with memory, and how sometimes the coldest places tell the warmest stories. Imagine the Earth locked in ice, quiet and glinting, as if the entire planet had paused to take a breath. For millions of years, glaciers have crept across the continents. Oceans have hidden beneath frozen lids, and the atmosphere cold, dry, and hushed. But deep beneath the surface, something is stirring. Earth may have frozen over, but its core never stopped burning. Beneath the thick shell of glacial ice, volcanoes continue to erupt, tirelessly venting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, quietly, persistently, like a kettle on low heat. And that's the key to Earth's great escape. Let's start with a bit of context. Under normal temperate conditions, volcanic CO2 is eventually absorbed back into the Earth. Rain pulls it from the atmosphere, it reacts with silicate rocks, forms carbonates, and gets washed into the sea. It's a lovely cycle, really, Earth's own built-in thermostat. But during Snowball Earth, that thermostat was busted. The land was covered in ice, the oceans were capped, and weathering, the key process that removes CO2, had all but stopped. No rain soaking into rocks, no rivers washing carbon into the sea, which meant every puff of volcanic gas stayed in the air, accumulating like steam in a sealed bathroom. Over millions of years, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere slowly crept upward, one burp at a time. Now, here's where things get spicy. CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and a potent one. The more of it you have, the more heat gets trapped near the surface, even if that surface is buried beneath kilometers of ice. Eventually, the atmosphere reached a critical tipping point. Scientists estimate that CO2 levels may have climbed to 350 times higher than today's levels. That's not just turning up the thermostat, that's throwing the whole thing into the sun. And then the thaw began. It wouldn't have been immediate, not like flipping a switch. But at some point, the warming from all that trapped heat began to overpower the icy feedback loop. The glaciers that had once marched toward the equator began to retreat. Sea ice cracked and thinned. Meltwater pooled on the surface. Earth's white mirror started to fade. And then things escalated, because once ice began to melt, the albedo effect, that reflective, ice-powered cooling, started working in reverse. Darker land and water absorbed more sunlight, which added more heat, which melted more ice, which absorbed more sunlight, and so on. A runaway greenhouse effect, but in the warming direction. This time, temperatures didn't just return to pleasant, they soared. Geological evidence suggests that average global temperatures may have spiked to tropical levels, possibly even up to 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas. Earth had gone from a snowball to a sauna. The oceans responded with chaotic joy. For millions of years, they had been capped and still. Now, with the ice gone, they stirred violently. Cold, stratified waters mixed with warmer layers. Trapped nutrients surged to the surface. The seas became chemical soup bowls of carbon, sulfur, iron, and oxygen. And this is when the capped carbonates we mentioned in Chapter 4 formed, those telltale layers of limestone that sit atop glacial debris. They crystallized quickly in the warming seas as carbon dioxide from the air dissolved into ocean water and precipitated out as calcium carbonate, a planetary sigh recorded in stone. But there's more. As the glaciers melted and retreated, the land was suddenly exposed to air and water again. And with that came intense weathering. Torrents of rain poured down, rivers carved new paths, and floods raced across bare rock. It was a time of geological rebirth, with erosion rates so high they reshaped entire landscapes. Volcanoes, no longer muffled by ice, spewed ash and gases freely into the atmosphere. Lightning cracked across turbulent skies. Thunderstorms roared over newly exposed coastlines. If Earth's frozen silence had been a lullaby, the thaw was a drum solo. And what about life? After millions of years surviving in shadowy refugia, microbial communities suddenly found themselves swimming in nutrient-rich, oxygenated waters. It was like going from a dim basement to an all-you-can-eat buffet under bright lights. Some scientists believe this period sparked an evolutionary surge, a prelude to the Cambrian explosion, when complex multicellular life would finally bloom. More on that in the next chapter, but for now, just sit with the sheer drama of it all. A world once frozen solid, wrapped in miles of glacial ice, had flipped, swinging wildly into heat, flood, and chaos, The kind of shift that makes you grateful for the relatively boring climate we usually enjoy today. Of course, this doesn't mean everything was smooth sailing. The post-thaw Earth was a volatile place, chemically and biologically. Oxygen levels didn't rise overnight. Many life forms probably didn't survive the transition. But for those that did, the stage was finally set for something new. It's a powerful reminder. Change, drastic, uncomfortable, overwhelming change, can make way for growth. So, as you drift off tonight, picture the Earth slowly thawing, glaciers retreating like shadows before dawn, seas waking up, sunlight dancing on waves not seen in millions of years, and microbes blinking in the brightness, preparing for their next big act. Coming up in Chapter 6, After the Thaw, A Changed World. The glaciers are gone, but their mark on Earth has only just begun. The glaciers have retreated. The air is thick, humid. Rivers rage, carving through freshly uncovered rock. Oceans churn and foam. And for the first time in millions of years, sunlight touches the equator without having to pass through a sheet of ice. Welcome to Earth, rebooted. The great melt wasn't just a matter of temperature. It was a planetary upheaval, a transition from stillness to storm, from deep freeze to dynamic rebirth. Imagine flipping the climate switch from Antarctica to a supercharged greenhouse in just a few thousand years. It was messy, it was violent, and it changed everything. Let's start with the landscape. As glaciers melted, they didn't simply disappear quietly into the ground. They released colossal volumes of meltwater, flooding the continents, roaring into the seas. Torrents of sediment were dragged along with the flow, gravel, silt, sand, all washed from newly exposed rock surfaces. The result, unprecedented erosion. Entire mountainsides were stripped bare. River systems formed rapidly. Valleys were carved. Shorelines reshaped. Earth looked like it had been pressure washed by a very enthusiastic cosmic janitor. Geologically speaking, this was a time of hyperactivity. The newly exposed crust, weathered by acidic rain and CO2, rich air, reacted vigorously. These reactions removed CO2 from the atmosphere, finally turning Earth's thermostat back toward balance. And then there were the oceans. Remember, during the snowball period, the oceans were largely sealed off from the atmosphere, stratified, and noxic in places. But with the thaw came oxygen, mixing, and nutrients. Lots and lots of nutrients. This triggered what scientists call ocean fertilization. All the iron and phosphates that had accumulated in the deep now surged toward the surface, feeding an explosion of microbial life. Algae bloomed. Bacteria multiplied. Photosynthesis went into overdrive. It was, in many ways, the planet's first big biological boom. Picture a world where the oceans turned green with life, microscopic, yes, but teeming, swirling, breathing. And this biological party had another consequence. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere began to rise, slowly but surely. For billions of years, oxygen had been produced mostly by cyanobacteria and locked away in rocks in the deep ocean. Now that oxygen had a place to go, a reason to stay. This change in ocean and atmospheric chemistry is preserved in the rock record. Scientists see it in the form of stable isotope shifts indicating a surge in carbon cycling, oxidized sediments showing increased availability of free oxygen, and those famous cap carbonates, which we mentioned before, formed quickly in the warm, mineral-rich oceans left behind after the melt. The post-glacial world was chaotic but fertile. And in that chaos, something extraordinary may have begun, the groundwork for complex life. Before the snowball events, life had been relatively simple: microbial mats, single-celled organisms, a very slow party, evolution-wise. But the environmental stress of the Snowball Earth, followed by the nutrient-rich, oxygen-boosted aftermath may have pushed evolution into overdrive. It's a bit like pruning a tree. The freeze cut things back harshly, but when the sun returned, growth exploded from every node. There's even a theory that this post-thaw phase helped set the stage for the Cambrian explosion, which would occur tens of millions of years later. It's not that multicellular life appeared immediately after the glaciers melted, but the conditions became more favorable than ever before. The planet was warmer, wetter, and chemically enriched. Oxygen was rising. Nutrients were plentiful. Ecological niches began to open. Think of it as the planet handing out golden tickets to the next round of evolutionary experiments. And now, a moment of humility. All of this, every glacier, every dropstone, every evolutionary spark, played out on a world with no humans, no trees, no fish, no birds, just microbes, time, and an endlessly shifting planet. It's awe-inspiring to realize that our modern world is built on the back of such deep history that every breath we take owes something to a long-forgotten algae bloom in the wake of an ancient thaw. So, as the Earth warmed, it didn't just heal, it transformed. Forests weren't here yet, nor were dinosaurs or even jellyfish. But in shallow coastal waters, simple multicellular organisms began to appear. Soft-bodied blobs, colonial plankton, primitive sponges. These were the ancestors, barely recognizable, but unmistakably the first steps toward complexity. The world after the snowball was still dangerous. Volcanoes rumbled, storms raged, CO2 levels remained high for a while. But the freeze had ended, and with it came motion, color, and the beginning of modern Earth as we know it. Let's also pause to appreciate how much we've learned from this chapter of Earth's story. Snowball Earth has become a model for understanding planetary feedback loops, how small changes can spiral into global transformations, climate resilience, how life can persist through the harshest of conditions, and even exoplanetary science, how frozen worlds around other stars might harbor life beneath their icy shells. In a strange way, Snowball Earth helps us understand the fragility of our own moment. It shows us that climate is not fixed, that life is not guaranteed, and that stability is a precious, temporary gift. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine a newly thawed world, rivers tumbling across virgin landscapes, oceans breathing deeply for the first time in eons, microbes swimming in the warmth, dividing, evolving, dreaming of what they might become. And in our next chapter, Chapter 7, we'll explore just that. The Cambrian curtain rises, and the lights begin to come on for complex life. The glaciers are gone. The world has warmed, and for the first time in eons, Earth isn't just recovering, it's getting ambitious. Welcome to the late Precambrian, a time that might feel like the quiet overture before a grand symphony. Earth has gone from silence and frost to a humming, swirling ecosystem of microscopic life. But now, something new is stirring in the shallows, complexity. This is the period leading up to the Cambrian explosion, a burst of biological innovation that will unfold around 541 million years ago. But the roots of that revolution, they were planted in the wet, warming wake of Snowball Earth. Let's rewind just a little and look at what life was like in the aftermath of the thaw. For billions of years, Earth had been ruled by prokaryotes, simple, single-celled organisms like bacteria and archaea. But now, after Snowball Earth, the stage is being set for the rise of eukaryotes, cells with nuclei, organelles, and a talent for collaboration. And with collaboration comes multicellularity. It started humbly, as many things do, clumps of cells sticking together, sharing tasks, experimenting with specialization. Some cells handled feeding, others helped with structure. These early team efforts may not sound glamorous, but they were the first sketches of what would one day become animals, plants, fungi, and yes, eventually us. And who were the early players? One of the stars of this new era was a group known as the Ediacaran biota. Named after the Ediacara Hills in Australia, where they were first discovered, these soft-bodied, alien-looking creatures lived around 575 to 541 million years ago. They were flat, frond-like, or blob-shaped, and they left behind the first large fossils of complex life. No jaws, no claws, no bones, just impressions in the sediment, like the ghostly outlines of forgotten dreams. The Ediacaran creatures were weird, wonderful, and deeply mysterious. Some looked like leaves, others like quilted pillows. There were discs, tubes, and shapes that defy categorization. Were they animals, fungi, giant amoebas, possibly something else entirely? We still don't know for sure, but they hint at the experimentation taking place in this newly fertile world. After the freeze, oxygen levels rose, nutrient cycles stabilized, and shallow marine habitats expanded. These were perfect conditions for evolution to try something bold. And then came the Cambrian. In the blink of geological time, around 541 million years ago, life erupted in diversity. We call it the Cambrian explosion, but don't picture a bang. This was more like a cosmic dawn, with light revealing life's hidden colors for the first time. In Cambrian seas, animals with hard shells, jointed legs, eyes, mouths, and mobility suddenly appeared. Creatures like trilobites, armored, segmented, and wildly successful. Anomalocaris, a bizarre, shrimp-like predator with rotating mouth parts. Wiwaxia, Opabinia, Hallucigenia, names as strange as the animals themselves. These weren't just new body plans. These were new possibilities: predation, burrowing, swimming, sensing. Evolution had found its groove and started remixing in every direction. Now, to be clear, Snowball Earth didn't cause the Cambrian explosion, but it likely set the stage. How? First, by pruning. The snowball glaciations may have acted as an evolutionary bottleneck, wiping out weaker lineages and allowing survivors to diversify rapidly afterward. Second, by fertilizing. The post-glacial world was rich in nutrients, oxygen, and ecological space. Third, by destabilizing, change creates opportunity, and Earth had just undergone a radical transformation. It's like the planet had cleared the chessboard, shuffled the rules, and then handed biology a whole new set of pieces, and Earth's biosphere was never the same again. From this point onward, life began to complexify, layer by layer, predator and prey, nervous systems, skeletons, ecosystems. The web of life grew thicker and stranger with every passing million years. The transition from a frozen Earth to a bursting, blooming one wasn't just a geological event. It was a biological turning point. The end of the snowball set in motion the long arc of evolution that would eventually lead to forests, flowers, fish, and philosophers. And here's a cozy thought for bedtime. Every part of you, every cell, every gene, every breath, traces its lineage back to something that survived that freeze. You're not just made of stardust. You're made of survivors, of resilience, of molecules that once floated in icy seas and endured. So, as you rest tonight, picture those first complex organisms drifting gently in warm Cambrian waters, not in a rush, just existing, learning to move, to sense, to evolve. The lights were coming on, the curtain had risen, and life was ready for its next big act. Coming up next, in Chapter 8, the debate melts on scientific controversy, where we'll gently enter the world of scholarly disagreements, slushball theories, and why scientists love to argue over rocks. Science, contrary to how it's sometimes portrayed, isn't about declaring eternal truths and moving on. It's more like an ongoing, very polite, and sometimes not so polite, argument that stretches across decades or even centuries. And when it comes to Snowball Earth, the debate is far from frozen. The Snowball Earth hypothesis, as elegant and dramatic as it is, hasn't gone unquestioned. In fact, it has sparked one of the most fascinating and occasionally fiery debates in modern geology and climate science. Because while the idea of a planet entirely encased in ice sounds poetic, not everyone is convinced it was quite that extreme. Let's start with a question that's surprisingly tricky to answer. Was the Earth really a snowball, or just a bit slushy? Enter the rival theory, Slushball Earth. The Slushball Earth model suggests that while glaciers did indeed extend close to the equator, the equatorial oceans themselves may have remained at least partially ice-free. In this version, Earth still went through a brutal ice age, but perhaps not a complete shutdown. Picture slushy oceans fringed with sea ice rather than a planet sealed in glass. It's a little less dramatic, but also perhaps a little more survivable. One of the main arguments against a full snowball scenario is the life problem. If the entire planet were frozen over with kilometers of solid ice, how could photosynthetic organisms have survived? How could any light reach the ocean beneath that icy cap? Supporters of Snowball Earth point to thin, equatorial ice, geothermal hotspots, or isolated refugia where life clung on. But critics suggest that a fully frozen ocean would have made survival near impossible for surface-dwelling microbes. The slushball model gives life a few more cracks to hide in, literally. Then there's the ice thickness issue. A full snowball Earth would likely require ice sheets up to 1 kilometer thick at the equator. That's a lot of ice. It raises questions about whether such thick sheets could have even formed without completely halting the hydrological cycle, rain, snow, evaporation, all the things Earth's climate needs to keep moving. And if the oceans were sealed off, how did enough CO2 build up to escape the freeze? Wouldn't the ice itself have slowed volcanic outgassing or reduced the effect of greenhouse warming? These are fair questions. Good ones, in fact, and they keep scientists up at night, though hopefully not our sleepy viewers. Some researchers also point out gaps and inconsistencies in the geological record. For example, in certain regions, sedimentary rocks formed during the snowball period show signs of normal weathering, implying the presence of running water. Other deposits seem to suggest glacial cycles rather than a single continuous freeze. These clues could point to a more dynamic climate than a total, static freeze would allow. But defenders of the snowball model have answers, too. They argue that refugia near hydrothermal vents or under thin ice could still support life, even during a global freeze. Volcanic CO2, accumulating over millions of years without being scrubbed out by weathering, could indeed spike the greenhouse effect high enough to trigger a catastrophic melt. And many of the supposed inconsistencies in the rock record can be explained by regional variations, tectonic quirks, or even post-glacial reworking. There's also the argument of simplicity and coherence. The snowball model does a tidy job of explaining the global distribution of glacial deposits, the sudden return of cap carbonates, and the striking chemical shifts found in rocks all over the world. But in the end, this isn't really a story of one side being right and the other being wrong. It's about the nature of science itself, because science thrives on uncertainty, on scrutiny, on poking and prodding and saying, yes, but what if? And Snowball Earth is a perfect playground for that curiosity. It sits at the intersection of geology, climatology, biology, and even planetary science. It's a riddle with billion-year-old clues and no easy answers, the kind of mystery that makes researchers pack their bags for remote outcrops in Namibia or hike into the icy hills of Canada just to chip away at a few ancient stones. The debate continues, not with shouting, but with sediment cores and isotope ratios and late-night arguments over coffee and core samples. Even today, as new evidence emerges and computer models grow more sophisticated, scientists still wrestle with the details. How many snowball events were there? How complete was the freeze? What exactly came before and after? Some even ask whether Snowball Earth could happen again. Don't worry, it's not likely anytime soon. We're trending in the other direction, unfortunately. And while we may never know exactly what the planet looked like 700 million years ago, the debate itself has enormous value. It sharpens our tools, expands our imagination, and forces us to think deeply about what makes a planet habitable and how thin the line is between teeming with life and completely frozen over. So tonight, as you settle under your blanket, think of Earth not just as a place, but as a puzzle, a riddle wrapped in rock, unraveled slowly by passionate people who argue kindly over billion-year-old clues. And in Chapter 9, we'll explore just that, why Snowball Earth still matters, not just to scientists in lab coats, but to all of us living on this fragile, ever-changing planet. At first glance, Snowball Earth might seem like an ancient curiosity, one of those deep-time oddities that belongs to a world so distant it's almost mythical, a frozen chapter locked away in billion-year-old rocks, studied by geologists in wide-brimmed hats and dusty field notes. But look a little closer, and you'll see something surprising. Snowball Earth matters now, perhaps more than ever. Let's start with the big picture. What the Snowball Earth hypothesis gives us, more than anything, is a window into Earth's climate system. Not just how it behaves under normal conditions, but how it behaves under stress, extreme stress. Because this wasn't just a cold snap. This was a complete planetary overhaul. A frozen ocean, a stalled hydrological cycle, life hanging on by bacterial fingernails, and then a reversal, a thaw so fierce it may have ended with tropical temperatures at the poles. It's a story of feedback loops, of climate tipping points, of delicate balances that can spiral wildly out of control with just the right push. And that has some very real, very modern implications. Today, we're facing our own climate challenges, driven not by ancient tectonics or fading suns, but by our own actions. Greenhouse gases are rising, ice is melting, and systems are shifting. Understanding Snowball Earth helps us ask, what happens when feedbacks accelerate? How does the Earth respond to extreme atmospheric changes? What are the long-term consequences of disrupting global climate equilibrium? Snowball Earth is like Earth's stress test, a glimpse of just how flexible and how fragile this system really is. But there's more. Snowball Earth isn't just relevant to climate scientists. It's also become a foundational idea in the search for life on other planets. Let's think beyond Earth for a moment. Out in the cold reaches of our solar system, there are icy moons like Europa and Enceladus, frozen on the outside, but with subsurface oceans that may hide warm vents and strange, shadowy ecosystems. Sound familiar? Just as life on Earth may have survived the snowball period by clinging to geothermal vents or under-ice oases, life beyond Earth might thrive in similarly hidden niches. In fact, when astrobiologists model what life might look like elsewhere, they often turn to Earth's extremes for guidance. Snowball Earth becomes a kind of biological reference manual, a case study in resilience. If life could endure when Earth looked like a frozen cue ball spinning through space, maybe it could do the same on another world. Maybe it's doing it right now. And that brings us to something a little more philosophical. Snowball Earth reminds us that life is tenacious, but not invincible, that complexity is a fragile, hard-earned achievement, that warmth, stability, and breathable air aren't permanent features of our world. They're gifts, temporary, precious, and deeply interconnected. It's easy to forget that our planet has changed so dramatically over time, that it has teetered on the edge of both fire and ice, that its past is full of mass extinctions, radical shifts, and improbable recoveries. But remembering these things helps put the present into context. When we study Snowball Earth, we're not just peering into a forgotten past. We're learning how planets work, how ecosystems endure, and how life adapts or disappears under pressure. And maybe, in some quiet way, we're also learning a little about ourselves, because every single plant, animal, fungus, and human on this planet descends from a survivor of that deep freeze. We are the legacy of that endurance. We are the warmth that followed the ice. So tonight, as you rest, take comfort in this strange and beautiful thought. The Earth has frozen solid. It has burned and flooded. It has seen the end of nearly everything. And yet here we are. Snowball Earth didn't destroy life. It humbled it. It refined it. And in the end, it helped shape the complexity we see today in coral reefs, in oak trees, in your own hands. As we drift into the final chapter, we'll leave the ancient past behind and return to the present, asking what lessons this frosty chapter can offer a warming world. So, close your eyes and imagine it. A quiet planet, once frozen, now spinning gently through the dark, carrying with it the memory of ice and the promise of life. And so, we've come full circle from a frozen, shimmering world to one teeming with warmth and complexity, from a silence broken only by the slow grind of glaciers to the symphony of life in all its endless variation. Snowball Earth wasn't just a chapter in geological history. It was a crucible, a test, one that nearly erased life, but also perhaps shaped it into something more resilient, more innovative, and more extraordinary. We've journeyed across hundreds of millions of years tonight, through the ancient glaciations of the Proterozoic, down into frozen oceans and volcanic pulses, across the Great Thaw, and into the early evolution of complex life. We've peeked into debates among geologists, followed trails of evidence buried in stone, and even imagined distant, icy worlds that might mirror our own deep past. But in the end, perhaps the most powerful lesson Snowball Earth gives us is one of perspective. Our planet, this bright blue that we call home, has known chaos. It has danced through extremes. And yet, again and again, life has emerged from the cold, not unchanged, not unscarred, but alive. And maybe that's something to carry with you, especially now, in a time when our climate is changing once again. Snowball Earth shows us both the fragility of the systems we depend on and the resilience that can emerge when conditions shift. We are, in every cell, descendants of survival. So, as you settle into sleep or let your thoughts drift elsewhere, I'll leave you with the same quiet questions I asked at the beginning. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? And has the story been relaxing or a little too interesting? If you're still awake, I hope you found the journey worthwhile and maybe learned something new along the way. And if you're already asleep, well, I hope your dreams are full of drifting continents, bubbling undersea vents, and snowflakes falling on ancient oceans. Before you go, or drift off completely, if you enjoyed this video, I'd be truly grateful if you gave it a gentle like and subscribe for more Sleepy Science. It helps the Sleepy Scientists continue to grow and share the wonders of our universe, one bedtime story at a time. Thank you for spending this time with me through frost and fire, silence and thaw. Good night, and may your world stay warm and wonderfully curious.